This presentation is about Benjamin Rush, the father of the temperance movement, and some of the offsprings which occurred, like the Washingtonian Society, the Oxford Group, and also AA, Alcoholics Anonymous. And the interaction between these groups and how they affected society today, and they become part of the fabric of addiction and alcoholism, and we're going to see how that all plays out. The virtues of temperance has been defined ever since the time of Aristotle in the 4th century BC as moderation in all things. Not too much of something and not too little. And also throughout history, there's been individuals that have abstained. For example, we have the Nazarites, which were Israelites consecrated to the service of God under vows to abstain from alcohol, let their hair grow, and avoid defilement by contacting with corpses. So we can see that temperance and being and abstaining from alcohol and drink is not something new. But in the 19th century, Protestant America as a whole was in the middle of a change in the way they viewed alcohol. And the church would soon lead the way with the temperance movement, asking a whole society to become teetotalers, like they say, was a new approach to the problem of alcohol abuse. And it was very unique to American Protestants. In 1784, Benjamin Rush was a noted and influential physician from Philadelphia, and he was also one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. He published a book, Medical Inquiries and Observations upon the Disease of the Mind. This book included Rush's view on alcoholism and his forward thinking on temperance. Rush was also a former Surgeon General of the Continental Army during the Revolution. He was the first prominent physician of his time to see alcoholism as a disease. Rush also saw alcoholism as a problem that required treatment, which was something totally different. He argued and established special hospital specifically designed to treat alcoholics, which were called sober houses, which was way, way ahead of its time. Rush describes the effects of alcohol as an odious disease, and he describes the symptoms as the following: unusual garrulity, unusual silence, captiousness, which is like a disposition to quarrel, an uncommon good humor, or shyness, or laughing, profanity, swearing, a disclosure of one's own secrets, a rudeness in the company of others, and a paroxysm of drunkenness occurs, which is the point where you are completely drunk. The face now becomes flushed, the eyes project, the head inclines a little, and the jaw drops. We begin to belch and hiccup, and we begin to stagger, and we see what we normally picture in our mind when we think of somebody that is drunk. Rush continues to describe the symptoms of alcoholism or alcohol use by going into some of the chronic physical effects, which include loss of appetite, puking in the morning. He mentions liver problems, jaundice, a cough, a persistent cough, and then a redness that erupts throughout different parts of the body, including the face, which he called rum buds when they appeared on the face. And now, I think one of the most common names is gin nose. You see like these red bumps in individuals' faces. Your breath becomes putrid, and last, he says, comes madness, and ultimately comes death. Today, Rush is viewed as the father of American psychiatry. And Rush, oddly enough, had no problem with drinking beer, wine, or hard cider. His primary concern was the health risk of distilled spirits or hard liquor. Rush said in a famous quote of alcoholism, to paraphrase, that the use of strong drink at first is a free agent for some individuals, but then form a habit that becomes and takes the place of that free agent. As we begin to look back at society after the Revolutionary War, what we see is that Americans were drinking a staggering amount of alcohol. They consumed liquor, wine, cider, and what happened was there was a change from drinking the beers and cider to hard liquor, and in the nation at that time, the distilleries started making a lot of the hard liquor, and by 1830, each person on an average was drinking more than 7 gallons of alcohol a year. That's a lot of not just beer, but also distilled alcohol, which was stronger, the hard liquor. And during that time, in many communities throughout the colonies, it was normal to drink for breakfast at midday, and have a whiskey at lunch, and beer with dinner, and have a nightcap before bed, and that was part of the life. There was a fair amount of alcohol consumed by kids too, which was kind of interesting. It was used as a sedative to help children sleep, and alcohol was thought of as, starving a fever. We've all heard some of these stories, to help ease digestion. It was a lot of home remedies that included alcohol. And if you didn't drink, you were endangering your health. It was part of the culture. It was so ingrained. In the 1940s, the school of thought was that alcoholics could not be helped. Many tried to address the issues and concerns of the society at that time without any success. The temperance movement focused on moderating the drinking behavior. In effect, preventing alcoholism and not dealing with it once it occurred. The rise of the Washingtonian Society in 1840 introduced the idea of the drunkard, the quote, drunkard. And once these individuals were seen as hopeless, but through this movement of the Washingtonian Society, they were able to be restored to a useful place in society. There are certain similarities between the Washingtonian movement and of the 19th century and present day fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. The similarities are striking, and we'll examine some of these in a bit. The Washingtonian movement was the first in the United States to bring about large-scale rehabilitation for alcoholics. And this created a lot of excitement in the nation because it was the first time that this was occurring. In Alcoholics Anonymous today, many of the members are concerned that they may have the same fate as the Washingtonian movement, and we'll see this develop as the presentation goes on. The Washingtonian movement is intimately linked to the larger temperance movement. Before 1930, temperance was not something that people rallied around. It was not a very popular cause. Even in 1912, when Lyman Beecher, which was a Presbyterian minister and co-founder and leader of the American Temperance Society, asked his fellow congressional ministers to formulate a program to combat intemperance. Their response was not quite what he expected. The committee reported that after faithful and prayerful inquiry, it was convincing that nothing could be done to check the growth of intemperance. It's important to point out that it was customary to serve liquor at ecclesiastical meetings, which probably influenced this prayerful inquiry. But Lyman Beecher headed a new committee which recommended the following steps: that district assemblies abstain from the use of alcohol at ecclesiastical meetings, that members of the church abstain from unlawful vending and purchase of liquor, and that farmers, mechanics, and manufacturers substitute monetary compensation for the ration of spirits. And also that they would reprint and circulate a pamphlet developed by Dr. Rush on the evils of drinking and alcohol use. What is Lyman Beecher went on to define intemperance as not merely drunkenness, but as daily use of inordinate spirits. And he did this in 6 sermons in 1825. In Boston, Beecher and Justin Edwards spearheaded the founding of the first national society, the American Society for the Promotion of Temperance. According to its constitution, it said it was to produce such change of public sentiment and such a renovation of the habit of individuals and the customs of the community that in that end temperance, with all its attending blessings, may universally prevail. The temperance movement began to take hold. In 1829, there were about 1,000 societies with memberships of approximately 100,000. By 1834, there were 5,000 local societies claiming about 110,000 members. The press also got a hold of this movement, and the legislator and the politicians began to take notice. In 1836, the American Temperance Society merged into a new and more exclusive group called the American Temperance Union, which decided to take a stand of total abstinence towards anything that can be intoxicating. Although this was an ambitious new orientation of total abstinence, it was not completely embraced by everyone. Surprisingly, more than 2,000 societies opposed the new pledge and were unwilling to go along with that. Many wealthy contributors were unwilling to forego their wine. They withdrew their support. Some leaders were discouraged and resisted the new pledge and became inactive. Various other controversial issues added to dissension among the ranks, which led to the downward momentum of the movement. And although another turning point was something that occurred on April 2nd, 1840, a Thursday evening when 6 friends gathered for a drink, as they always did, almost every evening, at Chasel's Tavern in Baltimore. They were William Mitchell, he was a tailor, John Hoss, a carpenter, David Anderson and George Steer, both were blacksmiths, James McCurley, a coachmaker, and Archibald Campbell, a silversmith. Their conversation turned to temperance, and which led that evening to the challenge of some of the individuals attending a lecture by a Reverend Matthew Hale. And in that lecture, he discussed the effects of alcohol. So as a result of that, some interesting events occurred. 3 days later, on Sunday, as these fine gentlemen were strolling through the park drinking, the suggestion planted by Reverend Matthew Hale Smith crystallized in their heads. And they decided to form a group. And Mitchell would be the president, Campbell was the vice president, Hoss the secretary, and the rest would be on a standing committee. And that they would have a membership fee of 25 cents and monthly dues of 12.5 cents. They also formulated a pledge, which was written by Mitchell, and the pledge was as follows: We, whose names are annexed, desirous of forming a society for our mutual benefit, and to guard against the pernicious practice of injury to our health, standing, and families, do pledge ourselves as gentlemen that we will not drink any spirits or malt liquor, wine, or cider. And thus the Washingtonian movement was born. The name Washingtonian Temperance Society was selected in honor of George Washington. 2 new members were brought in the second meeting, and strangely enough, the meeting continued at Chase's Tavern. So you're having a temperance, abstaining from alcohol meeting at a tavern. And that didn't last very long because the owner's wife objected to the increased loss of business. So Mitchell's wife suggested that they move the meeting to their home. And the meeting grew and grew, and they went to a carpenter's shop on Little Sharp Street, and eventually they rented their own hall because they grew and grew and grew. As they grew in membership, the problem of making their meetings interesting surfaced. And the president made a suggestion that each member would start to relay his own experience. And he started it off by telling his story of 15 years of excessive drinking, um, adding his reactions to his newly found freedom, followed by other members which did the same. This produced a very interesting effect, and people seemed to like that format, and interest mounted, and the membership grew. The society grew rapidly, and during those months and the first anniversary on April 5th, 1841, there were about 1,000 reformed drunkards and 5,000 other members and families and friends that paraded through Baltimore to celebrate the occasion. This demonstration was witnessed by over 40,000 individuals, and it became very popular to be part of the Washingtonian Temperance Society. The president had a motto: let every man be present and every man bring with him a man. The chief cause of decline of the Washingtonian movement was not the lack of participation, but the opposition to religion. It sounds kind of odd, but many Washingtonians felt that their movement represented a pure form of Christianity, not found in their churches. And this is what the churches objected to, not their anti-religious beliefs, but that they felt that they were more pure than what they were getting in their own churches. They felt that they were living the principles which the churches only talked about, which created tension. The conflict grew and grew, and the best example is the argument of a Reverend Harmon Matson, a minister of the Methodist Episcopal Church of Watertown, New York. He created a tract in 1844, and this is what the tract was saying. First, no Christian is at liberty to select or adopt any general system, organization, agency, or means for the moral reformation of mankind except those prescribed and recognized by Jesus Christ. But, secondly, Christ has designated his church as his chosen organization, his ministers as his chosen ambassadors or public teachers, and his gospel as the system of truth and motives by which to reform mankind. Nor has he prescribed any other means. Therefore, thirdly, all volunteer organizations and societies for the suppression of particular vices and the promotion of particular virtues being invented by a man without a divine model or command and proceeding upon principles employing agencies, means, and motives nor recognized in the gospel are incompatible with the plan ordained of heaven and consequently superfluous, inexpedient, and dangerous. Very interesting, isn't it? In 1935, in Akron, Ohio, a businessman named Bill Wilson and a physician named Bob Smith, better known as Bill W. and Dr. Bob, founded AA. Bill W. reflected on the Washingtonians as an object lesson for Alcoholics Anonymous. AA has similarities with the Washingtonians, and here are some examples. Alcoholics help each other. They held weekly meetings, shared their personal experiences. Each featured a fellowship group which was available to members. There was a reliance on God at first from AA. And even though there is still a focus, it has diminished a bit. And we'll talk about that later. And of course, the total abstinence. It is also important to remember some of the issues that occurred in controversy with the Washingtonians and see how Alcoholics Anonymous brought these into play as they began to develop their philosophy. The Washingtonians began to primarily lose their focus as they became embroiled in this controversy with the larger temperance movement. Once the Washingtonians had brought attention to the rehabilitation of individuals with alcohol issues or individual drunks, as they would say, the stage was set for specific therapies directed towards alcoholism. The best known of these was the Peabody method, prevalent in the 1930s, when little else was being done with alcoholics, Richard Peabody, in his book, A Common Sense of Drinking, was one of the main tools that Alcoholics Anonymous used in those early years uh, to develop the AA philosophies of abstinence. Interestingly enough, Alcoholics Anonymous also had its roots within the church. Um, Specifically, the Peabody method had its roots in the Emmanuel movement, which began in Boston in 1906 at the Emmanuel Episcopal Church. Its founder was Dr. Elwood Wooster, uh, and one of the earliest practitioners was Courtney Baylor, a alcoholic, which was probably the first paid therapist in the country. The movement encompassed not only a therapeutic approach, but also a support system and service to others. The church provided social hours and classes after the meeting, helping those individuals to give them moral support at the same time providing some material assistance. Peabody believed that all diseases, including alcoholism, had a physical, mental, and spiritual aspect. And they used relaxation therapy and suggestions to effect change in their patients. The way to deal with problems, they said, was not to fight them head on, but to divert the patient's attention to something more positive. Peabody, however, departed from his religious roots and took the therapeutic uh, direction in order to be, like he said, more professional. These therapists worked to reduce the patient's guilt and concentrated on the benefits of sober life, which is sort of different from the temperance movement, which advocated an emphasis on the evils of drink. Another movement which made an impact on Alcoholics Anonymous was the Oxford Group, an evangelical Christian movement started in 1920 or so by Frank Bachman. Um, he had a profound influence on the development of Alcoholics Anonymous. Bill W. and Dr. Bob, co-founders of AA, attended Oxford group meetings to find that it helped with drinking. And it was the Oxford groupers which brought them together. It brought Dr. Bob and Bill W. together. Um, the Akron, Ohio AA was an active group, and once Bill W. returned to New York, he was greatly influenced by Dr. Samuel Shoemaker of Calvary Church, a leader of the U.S. Oxford group, and one of the earliest friends of AA in the clergy. We can see the impact of the Oxford group into AA as we look at the four major principles, and these are incorporated into the 12-step program. Uh, One is surrendering to God through rigorous self-examination, confession of character defects to another human being, making restitution for harm done to others, and giving without thought of reward. But what was more problematic for Alcoholics Anonymous uh, were the four absolutes. And this is interesting when you look at what they are: absolute honesty, absolute selfishness, absolute purity, and absolute love. Um, why these became an obstacle for Alcoholics Anonymous, um, we will see a little bit of this later. The founders of AA believed that the Oxford group's evangelical approach would not work for alcoholics. Well, and they came up with the concept of God as we understood him, rather than a specific Christian or religious approach. So they started to take God out of the equation, just as it took the temperance movement a long time to value the drunk as a person. It took the medical profession many years to see the necessity for adequate treatment for alcoholics. They would just lock them up and not do anything, no treatment at all. Um, Towns Hospital in New York City, where Bill W. eventually got sober, was one of the first to recognize the importance of good medical treatment for alcoholics. We are finally coming full circle here. In 1930, Bill W. came under the care of Dr. Silkwood at Towns Hospital. He called him, Bill called him the little doctor who loved drunks. 146 years had passed since Rush published his book, Medical Inquiries and Observations upon the Disease of the Mind, where he first categorized alcoholism as a disease. And it took 146 years since that was first introduced to be reintroduced back into the community. Then in 1930, Silkwood reintroduced alcoholism as a disease to AA, and the basic concept was finally accepted as a disease, an obsession of the mind coupled with, as Silk would put it, an allergy of the body. Silkwood cautioned Bill W. against preaching to alcoholics or trying to immediately sell them on the Oxford group's concepts, such as absolute honesty. The doctor advised Bill W. to discuss his own experiences and obsessions that overwhelmed him to drink, and the physical sensitivity and allergic reactions he had with his body that eventually would drive him mad or kill him if he kept drinking. This advice set the stage for Bill's meeting with Dr. Bob, a meeting in which Bob, the medical man, first understood his disease as a medical condition. The meeting lasted all night and into the next day, and Alcoholics Anonymous was born. In Alcoholics Anonymous, members meet in groups to help one another achieve and maintain abstinence from alcohol. The meetings, which are free and open to anyone who is serious about stopping drinking, may include reading from the Big Book, sharing stories, celebrating membership varieties by presenting coins, as well as discussing the 12 steps and themes related to alcoholism. Participants are also encouraged to work the 12-step program, which is supposed to be integrated into their lives. AA targets problem drinking, and members are supposed to correct any defects of characters and adopt a new way of life. Participants are also encouraged to accomplish these difficult goals without any help. No therapist, psychologist, or physicians can attend AA meetings unless they too have a drinking problem. This makes it very difficult to do. The following is a list of the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm going to go through these. When we work the steps, as we are supposed to in Alcoholics Anonymous, we're supposed to do these in chronological order. For example, 1, then 2, then 3. You are not allowed to jump or skip steps or do the steps out of order. And you have someone that guides you through this process. These people are called sponsors, and they are not therapists, they are not doctors, or they're just other alcoholics which tell you when you are ready to go to the next step, and they help you in writing your inventory and all the other good things that you have to do as you go through the steps. And here are the 12 steps. We admit we are powerless over alcohol, that our lives have become unmanageable. 2, came to believe that a power greater than ourselves would restore us to sanity. 3, made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood Him. 4, made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. 5, admitted to God, to ourselves, and another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. 6, we're entirely ready to have God remove all of these defects of character. 7, humbly ask Him to remove our shortcomings. Made a list of all persons we have harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. Made direct amends to such people whenever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. 10, continued to take personal inventory, and when we were wrong, promptly admit it. 11, sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood Him, praying only for knowledge of His will for us and the power to carry that out. 12, having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, we try to carry this message to alcoholics and to practice these principles in all our affairs. And these are the 12 steps. The next 2 slides are references, which brings us to the end of this presentation. We can see a comprehensive history of the temperance movement and how what Benjamin Rush first conceived back in the 1700s has evolved through the centuries, and how we are currently using some of those concepts which we finally adopted of alcoholism as a disease. Thank you.